Hello and welcome to the Savage Movie Night podcast. Today we are talking about the 1996 horror classic Scream. I'm your hidden genius toiling away with the lime and the coconut guy at a low-level job, host Adam. Joining me, as always, is my too young to remember the greatness that was in living color co-host Kristen. Hi, Kristen.
Hey, Adam.
And of course, the show wouldn't be complete without our can never decide which he loves more Party of Five or Dawson's Creek co-host Rob. Hi, Rob.
Hey, what's happening, Adam?
Not much. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. Before we get started on the show itself, what is everyone's history with the Scream franchise? Kristen, I'll let you go first since I think you're probably the biggest fan among us.
Yes, and this was most of my pick, so of course I have a lot. Yeah, so I'm a big Scream fan. I mean, I've even been keeping up with the recent installations they put in. It's funny, even like the ones that I consider like the bad ones have kind of come around to them, and I'm like, oh, are they really that bad though? Like 3 and 4 are like always ones I didn't really like as much, but growing up, the older I get, the more I come to appreciate them. But yeah, big fan. I've seen all the movies. Really sad about the current state of the Scream franchise with all of that, but we'll see what happens there. It may be the end for now. I think they maybe need to take a break, have some time to kind of refresh.
Yeah, no, there's obviously been a lot of drama of people being in the cast, out of the cast, deciding, screw Nev Campbell, we're not going to pay her any money.
We're desperate, so now we need to put Nev Campbell in the script, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so it's a lot, but we don't have to get into all of that. But basically, I'm a big fan, and I would definitely see another Ghostface movie, but maybe not with whatever they're pulling out of their butt right now, because they're scrambling.
Yeah, and did you ever watch, there was a TV show, right?
Oh, yes, TV show, also a fan of that. I actually rewatched it a year or two ago, because I had seen it in college. It was pretty good. Third season, kind of weak, but the first two, I wish they had continue with that storyline, because the storyline never really got finished. You never really got to find that closure, but that one was pretty good too. It's cheesy, but I mean, Scream itself is very meta. It's very cheese. It's not meant to be totally taken seriously.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, it's funny because I was, I'm glad you pointed out which ones, that 3 and 4 were the ones you didn't like as much, at least initially, because I was going to ask which exact ones there were. Rob, what is your history with Scream?
I mean, it's nostalgia because when it first came out, it was such a cultural moment. Loved it. I was in my young 20s when it came out, so it gave me a lot of memories watching this again. But it was really just that. I never really maybe seen bits and pieces of other ones later on, like when it was on cable, but otherwise wasn't. It's not really my genre, so I didn't actively pursue seeing and follow the other movies.
Yeah. No, and for me, it was just huge cultural phenomenon that I was a teenager when it came out. And I mean, it was just everywhere. Everyone was talking about it. It was all over TV. The ghost-faced costume became ubiquitous. It was just everywhere. And then, I didn't see the first one in theaters. I saw it on VHS, rental. But then I saw the second one in theaters. And then I hadn't seen any of them since, not because I so much disliked the second one. By the time the third one came, so I just kind of ignored it. And then, especially by the time 4 and 5 came out, I was like, oh, wow, they're still doing this, huh? So, but, especially, after this, I am kind of curious to, check the rest of them out.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say they all have something that's kind of fun about them. Even the third one that is kind of not very well crafted. A lot of it was because of studio infiltration, them wanting different things, so they had to use multiple different scripts. But it's one of those things where there's something to appreciate about all of them, I would say. And I thought I did like what they were doing with this upcoming, with the recent iteration of it in 2022 and last year. They were both really good movies. I enjoyed them. I thought the reveal in this sixth one wasn't the greatest, but it was just fun for the nostalgia element. And they were building up to something really cool with one of the characters, Melissa Barrera's character, for reference, the one that they kicked out of the franchise. They were doing something really good with her character, so it really sucks that they aren't going to be able to like complete that trajectory of where her character was going to go. But it is what it is.
So there have been 6 total?
6. Yep.
Okay. That's one of those where sometimes you get confused, like, okay, if there have been 5 total and 4 sequels, or 5 sequels and 6 total, and they're working, that sometimes the numbering gets confusing, especially because it's not like, so.
Yeah, it got
awesome.
confusing also because they made Scream 5, just called it Scream, even though everyone was like, just call it Scream 5, call it what it is, it's Scream 5. Like that kind of thing.
Glad we all have some familiarity with it. Especially for Rob and I, this will be, a bit of a dive into our past. So, excited for that. On today's episode, we are going to learn how movie ratings work, why a woman has been trapped in a car by a rabid St. Bernard near the set, and what all this has to do with the adult film industry. Because today, we are talking all about the original Scream. But first, a word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Jazzology with Willard Jenkins. Jazzology is a fun and challenging jazz trivia show where 2 contestants go head-to-head for the chance to win $100 and prove their jazz knowledge. Watch along and see if you know the answers. Want to prove you are a true jazzologist by appearing as a contestant on the show? Use the link in the description of any episode to sign up. New episodes air every other Friday on Savage Content YouTube channel, youtube.com/Savage Content, and all past episodes are available under the Live tab. Thanks to Jazzology for sponsoring today's episode, and now, back to the show. Just a note before we get started, this episode does have a lot of connection to Harvey Weinstein. It's inevitable. We try not to talk about him too much. In the first part, we mainly just refer to anything he did in relation to the project in oblique terms, like executives with Miramax Dimension Films. But we do have to talk about him quite a bit in part, or not quite a bit, but we have to talk about him in more detail in part 2. So that's just a warning for everybody. We want to keep the show kind of light and fun, but unfortunately, there is going to be that shadow hanging over some of this, as he was not only heavily involved in this particular production, but also heavily involved in the life of one of the cast members that we talk about later on. So just a word of warning to any listeners that will come up. As always, before we talk about the film itself, we need to talk about how it was made. The story of Scream starts with screenwriter Kevin Williamson. Williamson was born in North Carolina in 1965. He grew up with an interest in theater, eventually getting a BFA in theater arts from East Carolina University, before moving to New York City to pursue a career in acting. While there, he appeared in the long-running soap opera Another World before moving to Los Angeles. In LA, he mainly landed bit parts in films so small they don't even have Wikipedia pages. Among these are films like Dirty Money and Hot Ticket. He also had very small parts in TV shows like In Living Color, which would become an interesting coincidence later on. He also took screenwriting classes at UCLA. And it was during these classes that he wrote the first screenplay that he would sell, the one that would establish him as a name. That, of course, is Killing Mrs. Tingle, retitled Teaching Mrs. Tingle before its 1999 release after years in development limbo. And while he sold his first script, Kevin was still far from making it. He found himself house-sitting for a friend in 1994, unsure of where his career was going. He tried acting, and it hadn't seemed to work. So far, writing seemed like it might be more of the same. Was it time to get a real job, maybe head back to North Carolina? That night, he watched a TV program on the Gainesville Ripper, a serial killer who would sneak into people's homes before murdering them. Later, He noticed an open window in the home and couldn't remember if he'd opened it himself. Williamson's nerves were on edge. He grabbed the cordless phone, still somewhat of a new thing in 1994, and a kitchen knife. He called a friend to talk to him in case anything happened as he searched the house. They ended up talking about scary movies. After he calmed down and discovered there was no intruder, he went to sleep and had a nightmare that evening. The next morning, with all that mixed together in his brain, he began writing his classic and called it Scary Movie. So, what do you guys think?
I'm glad he kept writing, that's for sure. It always seems to happen that way. It's like you just got to find that idea to make it work. And also, yeah, like it's funny that they decide he went with Scary Movie at first because, I mean, even the idea of like a scary movie is like a very big motif in the whole thing with Ghostface, of course. So it's interesting that was the initial title. I love that.
It's a super relatable story too, like I think we've all kind of had some experiences like that where we've gotten like inspiration from, a traumatic day, a nightmare, or some crazy thoughts, and then from that stems, maybe a brilliant idea or a new way of approaching a problem or whatever. So, it's a very relatable story. I just, I wish I could do that. I wish I could, like, the next day write all these things down that I have in my head, because I don't think I'd be able to get anything else done.
Yeah, no, totally. Really cool how he combined everything. We'll talk a bit more about his approach in a second. But, with the title, that definitely is something we'll come back to a bit as especially as we keep telling the story. And it's just so, and you definitely see Scary Movie as being an appropriate title from, like, as you said, Kristen, the reoccurring motif. And it's just so hard to separate yourself in 2024 from Scary Movie and what we'll talk about that ends up connotating to an audience. And would that still feel, do we have the feelings around that title because of what comes later, or would it still be just as effective if they called it Scary Movie instead of Scream?
I mean, also, when you think about how meta the whole entire film is, calling it Scary Movie would have just fed into the meta nature of it too. So I think it would have worked.
Yeah.
People may have thought it was a little on the nose, but I think that's kind of the point given the meta nature of the whole script.
Yeah, but we'll talk about it more as we get to the name change later. But it's just interesting. And so, just one note from Colleen when she was editing the text in my script last night. And it was like towards the end of the workday yesterday, and she left a note in the script around the Gainesville Ripper stuff. P.S. I looked him up on Wiki for a little more context to make sure I was getting the edit rights, and said, I can never unread this, and I blame you, Adam. Lol.
Yeah, this is definitely not her jam. This kind of stuff is definitely not her thing. But yeah. we thank you for doing it anyway, Colleen.
Yes, but and like, as much as it served in inspiration, like it was more the idea of a killer and some of that, like the Gainesville Ripper's actual crimes were not that relevant to the final plot, the final movie, the final script. And so that's where I didn't go into a ton of detail about what he did, but like every story about the writing of Scream brings up the Gainesville Ripper, and some almost try and make it like it's based on a true story. And so that's where I felt like I had to mention it. But and what he did that kind of inspired it. But that's where we frighten, we give Colleen nightmares, especially with a new baby in the house. So awesome.
I think I'm gonna have to hit Wikipedia or Google. What was the name? The Gainesville Ripper. I don't know much about that story, but you got me intrigued.
Yeah. No, basically he was a guy who would sneak into especially women's apartments, and usually while they were sleeping, and then subdue them and, do bad things to them and kill them. So not very pleasant, but, it's also like, if you look at what Scream is about, that isn't quite the same thing. So it's more just, the brutality and,
right,
stuff
the intrusion and all that.
Right. The violation of privacy and stuff like that. I was very surprised to see Kevin Williamson, one of his few acting roles, had been on In Living Color, which was a great show I remember watching growing up. Gave Jim Carrey his start. And we'll talk about it more. So many famous people connected to that show, but we'll talk about why it's especially surprising that's one of his few acting roles when we get to the aftermath in part 2. I realize there's a lot of stuff in this initial part where it's like, ooh, but you wait until we talk about it in part 2. Since we have a lot of stuff to talk about, let's keep going.
Yes.
Well, Williamson completed the script along with the short outlines for 2 sequels over the course of 3 days. This was going to be a love letter and a send-up of the slasher films he grew up with. It was going to be the kind of movie they weren't making at the time, but one that he wanted to see. It would also serve as a counterpoint to the growing moral outrage against violence in media, especially horror and slasher films. He wanted to show that it wasn't the media that made the killers. Despite his passion for the work, he had little hope that it would get purchased, let alone made. He mainly hoped that if people liked it, it might lead to other work. Simply, it was to be a foot in the door. That script ended up kicking the whole door in, and soon multiple studios were bidding for the rights. Ultimately, Kevin selected Dimension Films, a subsidiary of art house film giant Miramax, itself a subsidiary of Disney at this point, even though they offered less money. Other studios had offered more, but as he had already experienced with Killing Mrs. Tingle, the purchase of a script was very different from the making of a movie based on that script. He selected Dimension, believing they were most likely to get the script into production quickly. And they planned to. They just first had to find a director.
Yeah, this is also bringing up stuff that we will also be discussing, annoyingly, in part 2 when we get into the plot. But obviously, the idea of media not making the killers is also a very big theme that does play a big part in the third act of this movie. So definitely succeeded in getting that point across.
You can see, as we'll talk about when we talk about just the plot in general, both towards the end of this episode and then, towards the end of this part and then through all part 2, that it really is a love letter to, slasher films, both in, like with the rules, kind of poking fun at the tropes of slasher films, but also knowing how to make a good one because of having watched so many. It's really interesting. And, it's also interesting that, if he was going to sell this, he wanted to see it actually produced. So he was willing to take more money for what he thought was a more likely path to get it produced. Dimension was the genre subsidiary, was the genre subarm of Miramax. Miramax at this time was just really becoming the powerhouse it would become. Pulp Fiction had just come out a few years before. Clerks. I think Chasing Amy was either the same year or the next year. So a lot of the things that would help establish Miramax as Miramax were starting to happen. And, it was now under the Disney umbrella as well. So it was really becoming this powerhouse. But at the same time, while Dimension had been established, it still wasn't known for producing this kind of movie. So it was taking an interesting chance all the way around.
I think that you meant to say that he would take it for less money, but have a better chance of it getting produced.
Yes. I'm sorry if I misspoke. That's what I was definitely trying to say. Many names were offered to direct the film. Some up and coming, some established, some legends, some who would become legends. This list included, but is not limited to, Sam Raimi, Danny Boyle, Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, Tom McLaughlin, and George Romero. They all passed or had to drop out for various reasons, but there was a name that kept coming up as being perfect for the film. One name that had been offered the film multiple times and kept saying no: Wes Craven. Wes Craven was born in Cleveland in 1939 into a strict Baptist family. After getting a degree in English and psychology from Wheaton College in Ohio, he began teaching English in Pennsylvania and New York. But the purchase of a 16-millimeter camera during this time led to his true passion. He soon left teaching and moved to New York, first finding work as a sound editor. One of his friends who had recommended Wes move to the city was Steve Chapin, whose brother Harry was a struggling musician making industrial films to get by. Harry acted as a mentor to Craven, teaching him what Wes would later call the Chapin method of editing. Nuts and bolts, get rid of the shit. In addition to working his way up the ladder with the industrial company, Craven also made money and honed his skills working uncredited, according to Wes himself, quote, on many hardcore X-rated films, unquote, including undisclosed work on Deep Throat.
Cleveland, man. What is it about Cleveland? They're all from Cleveland. Like a bunch of famous people come out of Ohio. It's so fascinating to me.
Well, it's been pointed out that Ohio has produced more astronauts than any other state, and that's because, and we have many innovations in flight, like the Wright brothers, and that's because it's been pointed out people want to get as far as from Ohio as humanly possible.
That makes sense. That's fair, I guess.
Yeah. So
I would definitely want to get out of Cleveland.
Hilarious.
But yeah, it's interesting looking at the other list of different people that could have done it. It would have been a very different film had any of these other people. Really.
Yeah, well, and there are some like Sam Raimi, even Robert Rodriguez, and George Romero. Makes sense. Tom McLaughlin is a name most people don't know, but he had directed Jason Lives, so he kind of makes sense. Tarantino.
I would not would have wanted it to be Tarantino. No offense to his film, it's not the right vibe.
I know he had just worked with Rodriguez. He had written From Dusk Till Dawn, so that's kind of, that has horror elements, but this doesn't feel like a Tarantino kind of movie.
Right.
Danny Boyle, as much as he did with 28 Days Later, this doesn't feel like a Danny Boyle type movie. And keep in mind, Danny Boyle hadn't even done Trainspotting yet. It's nuts to see his name in there. Then you see, for those who don't know, because I kind of deliberately tried to hide it, Harry Chapin is a very famous musician. He did the song Lime and the Coconut. He did the song from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Raindrops keep falling on my head. He did a ton of songs. Very, very famous musician, but as it kind of indicated here, before he got his big break, he was working in these industrial films, and was the brother, and friend of Wes Craven. And then it's especially interesting, Wes did this work in adult films, not just only, so to give a little too much background on how adult films worked at the time. They were, for the most part, illegal to actually produce and distribute. That they had to be kind of underground. The mob was involved in a lot of them. And it was only around the time of Deep Throat that some obscenity laws got changed. And that's also where you started to see change in production. That's where you started to see them do more of these, what we think of now as like stereotypical movie-like adult films, where like Deep Throat and Behind the Green Door and The Devil and Miss Jones, some of those that were actually like top 10 box office for the years they came out in the U.S. Because the 70s were a weird time, man. But
it also meant that these films were in focus.
yeah, but it also so like a lot of guys who were, the same as especially once the industry moved more to LA out of New York, as it became more legitimate and got out of the mob control in this period. Even when it was in New York, you'd have professionals who would either want the extra money or the extra work to hone their skills, so they would work on it. But a lot of it was in reels, where it was just like short little scenes. So like they do like maybe a 10, 15-minute scene, and that's all it was. That it's a lot more, we've almost gone back to that in a way, that a lot more like the scenes you see online would be more of what you would have, only with less production value and less bothering with a script, would be what you would have seen in the 70s. So that's a lot of what Wes is making. And between that and the industrial work, it's amazing he gets as much of an artistic eye as he does, because he is really getting trained onto how to just set up, shoot as little waste as possible, skin the buffalo and do it as cheaply as possible, because no one cares about, your art. It's all about, the actual end result. This all led to him finally making his feature film debut, writing and directing The Last House on the Left in 1973. This was a brutal, graphic rape revenge film and became a minor hit, earning over $2 million against a $90,000 budget. The film was known for its intense gore and spawned an advertising slogan that would be recycled and parodied for decades. Just keep telling yourself, it's only a movie. But the success came at a cost. As it was his first film, and because of the content, Craven had believed it would only ever be screened in a small number of theaters. That had given him the internal freedom to push boundaries of taste and acceptability, because while his name was attached to it, it was like the porn he had made. It would disappear with no stigma attaching to him. With the widespread showing, Craven found himself ostracized and pigeonholed. 5 years later, he made the only project he could, The Hills Have Eyes, cementing his reputation as a horror and gore guy. But it did lead to more mainstream work, with Deadly Blessing in 1981 for United Artists and Swamp Thing for Embassy Pictures in 1982. However, it was 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street that catapulted Craven from the cult to becoming synonymous with horror movies around the world.
I think the other thing that it did was with A Nightmare on Elm Street, he was able to expand from, like just a regular, I don't know if it was intentional or it was just, this became its own thing, but it felt like, a movie that probably was originally meant for horror movie followers ended up expanding to a much wider audience than originally intended.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And yeah. His getting attached to a horror project after this meant it would get made, but it also, came with certain stigmas, that he could only do horror projects and, as we'll talk about later, and, also some issues with getting the film released the way he wanted it to, as we'll talk about later as well. But like Kristen, have you seen what of Wes's early work have you seen? Because I know you're a big horror person.
Yeah, so here's the thing. I have no interest in seeing The Last House on the Left because I know what's in it. I know what it's about. And I definitely, I can handle a lot of horror, but I don't enjoy rape in my horror. It's just not something a little too real, too real to life, that I don't enjoy seeing that kind of thing on screen. And I know this one is pretty brutal, so I have pretty much avoided it like the plague because it's like I know what it's about, and that's enough. And it's interesting because when you do look at his older work, a lot of that stuff it's really gritty and brutal. I mean, The Hills Have Eyes also has a lot of that horrible kind of like meanness about it. And it's interesting, like what Rob was saying about how Nightmare became so mainstream, because a lot of the older work definitely is more like niche, more like interested in certain types of horror people, as opposed to the slasher, which the slasher at this time of Nightmare was really big, which is why it makes sense also for him to later do Scream, because I think he is best in his slasher realm. And not to say that The Hills Have Eyes wasn't a good movie. I can just skip the really terrible part of that I was referring to before. But
Yeah.
I've seen some of his other stuff afterwards. So like I know the werewolf one, whatever that one's called. I think
Yeah.
it's Wes Craven.
Yeah. Well, there was Cursed. That was in the 2000s.
Yeah, I've seen that one.
That's Christina Ricci. No,
Lovely.
like I've seen all these early ones. It's been a very long time since I've seen The Hills Have Eyes. It's been a while since I've seen I don't know if I watched all of The Last House on the Left, because again, like I think I put it on because someone was over who like wanted something really brutal, and that was like the most brutal movie I could find that was on like Amazon Prime or something. So I don't even know if I watched it all, but I actually recently watched Deadly Blessing and Swamp Thing before you even. I rewatched Swamp Thing. That's not even as much a horror. That's almost like more of like a sci-fi action movie, and there's some comedy in it. Like it's PG, I believe. But then Deadly Blessing is definitely a horror film. It's not great. It's got a young Sharon Stone in it. But it's also got none of the unpleasant stuff like we were talking about, like with Last House and The Hills. And it doesn't actually have that much gore. It's R-rated, but not a ton of gore. It's the thing I've noticed with all of Wes's movies. They are beautifully shot. He is that even when I don't I find he's great at keeping pacing, even when the script isn't great. That he is just really talented. I think, he's probably even better as just a director than a writer. And so, when you get a really good script, like from Kevin Williamson, it's going to lead to a much better movie than some of the ones where, like, Deadly Blessing or like After Elm Street Shocker, or some of those where you watch it and you're like, yeah, the script is a bit of a mess, but he's making the most out of it, and making a beautiful film that keeps moving. So
yeah, I agree with you, and I think that a majority of his work are like perfect candidates for the old Elvira show. They're just,
Well, it's like
a lot of
we'll talk about Shocker, which is another one of it, because like after watching Scream, I went on a bit of a Wes Craven kick that I'd still like to keep going, but because there are still a lot of his that I haven't watched, but I did happen to watch Shocker recently, and it's not a great movie, but I still enjoyed watching it because, again, the production values were really good and how he shot it, and it's not too slow. It never gets too slow, even when it's kind of dumb. And Peter Berg isn't the most likable as the main character, but you can kind of get over that. So it's one I would watch again. Like that. That's how as I've been doing my letterbox, that's how I kind of judge whether I say I liked it or I didn't, is how likely I am to potentially rewatch it. And Deadly Blessing, I was less likely to want to rewatch than Shocker. Pretty much, I would say, seek out a Wes Craven film if you've never, and check it out, because even if it's bad, it's still find a lot of good stuff in it. But A Nightmare on Elm Street was a massive hit. And I'm sure we'll one day go into the history of the franchise in a future episode that actually gets released to the public, as opposed to when we did one of the Elm Street movies in a test episode that's never getting released. For now, know that it was made that it made $57 million against a budget of $1.1 million and spawned a franchise. But Craven wouldn't return to it himself until 10 years later for the seventh, and at the time, final installment in 1994. In the meantime, Wes worked on numerous other horror films, including The Serpent and the Rainbow, Shocker, and The People Under the Stairs, to mixed results. Even his return to Elm Street, Wes Craven's A New Nightmare, a meta take on the whole thing, while profitable, was disappointing compared to the returns of the original. More than anything at this time in his career, what Wes wanted was to take a break from horror and do something different. He didn't want to do another slasher, and he had just done the whole metatextual thing with New Nightmare. He did take a lunch meeting with Williamson, but came across as disinterested and left Kevin unsure if Wes had even read the script. But Craven's assistant, Julie Plec, was an advocate for the project. She had read the script and loved it and believed in it and thought Wes would be right for the job. She became friendly with Williamson, who was nervous that if they couldn't land Craven for the project, it might turn out badly or get stuck in development hell. And she assured him that it would all work out. She knew the project still hadn't landed a director and went to Wes, who, despite Craven's feelings at the earlier meeting, had read and loved the script. After turning down the project several times already, he was in a slightly different place in 1995. Vampire in Brooklyn, a romantic comedy with horror elements starring Eddie Murphy, had bombed at the box office. The project he had planned to work on next, a remake of The House on Haunted Hill, had just been canceled. When Julie told him Scary Movie still needed a director, he said to tell them to make him an offer he couldn't refuse. They did, and the project finally had its director.
Well, thanks to Julie Plec. You're a real one, Julie.
Well, thank you to Vampire in Brooklyn for failing horribly.
Never even heard of it. That's so crazy.
Shout out to Serpent and the Rainbow. That's a I think there's a documentary on that as well, but that's a really interesting film. And the background on it, if you get a chance, check it out. It's has to do with zombies and voodoo and whatnot in Haiti.
It's based on a book of more of an pop
anthology.
Anthropology is the word I was trying to say, because my tongue does not want to cooperate. Pop anthropology book, and so, but then they took it and really Hollywoodized it for the movie. So the book and the movie share the title, and the idea that they're exploring, the potential roots of voodoo and zombie myths, but and is this certain powder potential to cause the effects described as zombieism, but really are just like a drug-induced trance kind of thing.
A real thing, by the way.
Yeah. But then the movie really sensationalizes it and makes it a movie, which is what they do. But it has Bill Pullman in it. Definitely on my list to watch in the near future. Well, and it's also funny because as we'll talk about, a lot of projects after Scream comes out go forward that hadn't before. And so the House on Haunted Hill remake does get made just with Jan de Bont, I believe, as the director. I think it comes out in like 99.
It might have been 2000s. Let me look. Because the remake did come out, and I actually did like the remake of it. Oh, it is 99. Okay. I thought it was like 2004.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that comes across in a lot of his films is that he kind of respects the audience more than a lot of other directors. I mean, he kind of knows, if you're a fan of these films, kind of knows what you're expecting and plays with that and has a higher respect than a lot of other directors.
Well, like everyone I see, whether it was the screencast or cast members from other projects, really Williamson himself, tend to describe him as like professorial. That he came across a lot as like a college professor, with fatherly undertones, so that makes sense. Like when you look at his background as, with major, degrees in English and psychology, and also, was a teacher for a while, and that kind of vibe carried with him, and I think that comes across then not just in how he approaches the movie, but how he treats his talent behind the scenes, and seemed to just be a very lovely man to work with. With Craven on board, Williamson was worried he would come in and completely change the script. But when he got it back, all there were notes related to typos in the script, true to Craven's professorial nature. To Kevin's surprise, Wes did truly love the script and didn't want to change anything. It was now time to start casting. And while we will talk about the actors who were chosen for the film as we go through the plot, we can first talk about some interesting names who were almost chosen instead. Among the names considered for the main role of Sidney Prescott, Molly Ringwald was Williams's preferred choice, but Molly felt that at 28 she was too old for the part. Reese Witherspoon was strongly considered, but it was felt she would look too young alongside the rest of the cast. It was down to 3 names in the end. Brittany Murphy, who had just had a breakout role in Clueless the year before, Alicia Witt, who you can learn more about in our Dune episode because we just talked about her, and the actress who got the role. For the role of Gale Weathers, names like Brooke Shields and Janine Garofalo were considered. Vince Vaughn was a favorite for the role of Billy Loomis before auditions, but got sick and was unable to read for the part. Seth Green, Jason Lee, and Breckin Meyer were all up for the role of Randy. And finally, Thora Birch and Natasha Lyonne were finalists for the part of Tatum.
Man, I'm so glad it wasn't Vince Vaughn for Billy Loomis.
Man, right? I was thinking the same thing.
Weird.
Totally.
Like, what's also weird is, like, I don't think of him and Skeet Ulrich as being the same age, and they are.
Oh, yeah. But I think Skeet was such a perfect for this role.
They're
like
the same
he's
age?
got this like
That's
skeevy kind of nature about him. He fits the role so perfectly. And I don't know if Vince Vaughn would have been able to capture. I don't know. Maybe I'm being hard on Vince Vaughn. Maybe he would have been okay. But
sometimes there's clips of these actors when they do readings that gets leaked out. You're going to make me go look for these because I hope they exist online. I would love to see some of these reads.
Yeah, I don't know if there are any for these. I didn't see any on some of the special features I looked through. But
also, I feel it would have been interesting if Brittany Murphy had done it because they probably wouldn't have had as much of this franchise given that she passed away.
Yeah, but I think she wouldn't. Like, I know they say she was a finalist, but I think she would have had the same problem Reese did because, like, Reese, like most of the cast is. Who play the teenagers were born around like 1970, 71 or so. Reese was born in 1975, and Brittany Murphy was like 75, 76, or maybe even a little younger than that. Like I'd have to look it up, but because she was very young in Clueless, like she's around the character's age of like 15 or 16. In Clueless, and so she's obviously not that much older here. So she would have looked, if you're worried that, a 20-year-old Reese Witherspoon is going to look too young against your 25-year-old cast, Brittany Murphy was going to look way too young.
I mean, that's a valid point. Although I think Brittany Murphy would have done great. She has this kind of face for it. And the other thing is that what's Reese Witherspoon? She's very petite. She's just a young looking.
No.
She just looks young for a long time in her career. She's very small.
And that was also like the problem with both Thora Birch and Natasha Lyonne is because they're like Thora Birch is barely older than I am, and Natasha Lyonne is not much older than that, and so they were both underage, and I think they actually wanted Leone over the actress who ultimately got the role, but they ended up because she would have been 17, and there are certain work requirements that change when you're underage, unless you're emancipated. They ended up deciding to go with a different actress. But then, especially like Seth Green, Jason Lee, Breckin Meyer for Randy, like you could see any of them slotting in. Yeah, no, those all make sense that they were up for the same role. Yeah, no, it's all very interesting what ifs. With the cast selected, filming began on April 14th, 1996 in Santa Rosa, California, the heart of wine country. The first scene filmed was actually the opening. It was shot in an isolated farmhouse. In order to keep all the crew and equipment out of view when filming, they had to set up a base camp at the only other nearby property, another farmhouse that had, coincidentally, been used to film Cujo over 10 years prior. After viewing the dailies from the early shooting, executives from Dimension Miramax hated the results. They sent Craven footage from another project in the works, Night Watch, a 1997 film starring Ewan McGregor that flopped at the box office and with critics, as an example of how he is supposed to be doing things. There was even talk of removing Craven from the film. Craven asked to be allowed to edit the first scene together as he intended and show it to them. The executives were blown away and left him alone after that.
Wait, they saw the dailies of the scenes that like the opening scene?
Yeah, so admittedly, things can look a little different in dailies than they do when truly edited together, because dailies, especially for a company that, again, we kind of talked about, Dimension is really just establishing itself as a genre house, and these guys are micromanagers. They have experience with art house pictures, with more kind of indie pictures like Pulp Fiction, and that kind of thing. They know what works there. They don't have as much experience like with a horror film and what's going to work and not work there. Clearly, as seen as they thought, because Night Watch has Ewan McGregor, it has like Nick Nolte and Josh Brolin. They thought this was going to be a huge breakout thing, and it flopped hard.
It's such a classic, business versus creative, struggle here, and to suggest the dailies gave us these feelings that you're going in the wrong direction. You should go in this direction. And the example was a movie that bombed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, admittedly, when they're showing it to them,
it hadn't come out yet, right? So they thought it was going to do good.
Night Watch comes out after Scream does. So even though they already had it, was already edited while Scream was being filmed. To the point
but
they could say.
This also just goes into a running problem with horror in general, with executives trying to put out things they think people want. And then the things that are actually good, that are actually original, get kind of put underneath. They don't get theater releases. This is still a problem in 2024 with horror. Some of the most original good ones don't get those theater releases. They get put to streaming or direct to video. And then the franchises just keep getting recycled over and over again. The remakes, they get the big ones because they know they'll get people out there. So it's just like executives not understanding what people actually want.
Yeah, well, and as Rob just chimed in, that's not just a horror problem these days. That's all of Hollywood problem. For many on the production, the shoot, it was like summer camp. They were isolated both by the location and working hours, as most of the filming took place at night. They would return to the hotel everyone was staying at, often covered in fake blood in the wee hours of the morning. They talked about how hard it was to get all the fake blood off, and that the staff must have hated them because the sheets and pillowcases, for all the sheets and pillowcases they ruined by mistake because they didn't get all the fake blood off. One actor turned their room into the party hangout by going to Spencer's Gift and buying almost everything in the store. It became known as the bar. The cast bonded by hanging out, drinking, and watching the sun come up. They would then tack sheets over the windows to help cut out the light and sleep until they had to be back on set.
That sounds like such a fun time. Like, I'm sure that was such a special moment for them. Just like because
the best camp ever.
Yeah, and like, I mean, because a lot of the actors, they still really do think fondly of this. I mean, I've gone to horror conventions where they will still speak at these things and take Q&As, and they've always talked about how it was like such a good experience making this movie.
A lot of productions are like a summer camp because they last, like 8 weeks or so. And relationships build up on the set. And then, just like, summer, when summer camp ends, a lot of times those relationships don't last. And there are some, relationships that develop on set that last longer than others. But, there are definitely family atmospheres thrown around a lot. And that seems to definitely be true with this. And that, again, gets back into Wes Craven's professorial parental nature. And I think that really helped with a lot of things. Well, when filming wrapped on June 14th of 1996, the film was still called Scary Movie. The cast and crew even got gift baskets and jackets with that name on them. But there was pressure to change it, as executives felt it sounded like a comedy title. A year earlier, in the midst of accusations of inappropriate behavior with children, Michael Jackson and his sister Janet released a song called Scream. An executive with a history of questionable moral judgment thought they should use the same title for their movie, and thus Scary Movie became Scream. The next fight was with the then MPAA, today known as MPA, ratings board. This was a familiar arena for Craven, as by this time he had gone through this battle with nearly every one of his previous films. To explain in brief for those unfamiliar, and this is a very simplified and condensed version of it that I would...
You can do it, Adam.
Condensed. Well, no, I was just saying in some future episode we'll probably take the time and go in even more in depth in this. This is history, a little of how the U.S. does ratings. So, at the start of the film industry in the U.S., there was no governing body related to content. However, by the late 1920s, there was a growing public backlash to the amount of mature content in the films being made. To prevent government intervention, the industry adopted the Hays Code in 1934, and each film had to be submitted to ensure that it met the standards of the code, or else it would be banned from release. In late 1968, the industry abandoned the code in favor of a rating system. The idea was that instead of making every film conform to one absolute standard regardless of intended audience, a rating system would give guidance to audiences about the type of content they could expect in a given film and make a decision to see it or not based on that. Films are submitted to a ratings board and given a rating. If they would like a lower rating, they are given guidance on what is triggering the current rating, allowing them to make changes and resubmit. Each board reviewing each movie is different, and standards are not written down. So at times, ratings and changes needed can end up feeling and even being arbitrary and capricious. For Scream, in part because of Wes's reputation with movies like The Hills Have Eyes and Last House on the Left and Nightmare on Elm Street, one of the reoccurring notes was about the intensity. The scenes, which could not be reshot at this point, were too intense. They were given the dreaded and restrictive NC-17 rating. It took 9 attempts, including minute changes like reducing the amount of jiggle seen in intestines, to get the desired R rating.
I would have seen the NC-17 one. I think that one would have been quite interesting. Mm-hmm. I mean, because I don't think Scream is really too intense. I mean, of course it's bloody and all that, but yeah, it definitely could have been way worse.
Yeah,
so compared to some others, I would have liked to see the jiggles.
Yeah, no, well, like I said, I think some of it was also it's almost like when you have a reputation and you go before a judge, even if you
Right.
didn't do it, or you would normally get, like a slap on the wrist for it. You get judged more harshly. I think, the ratings board tended to view Wes's work more harshly, and so every time he was up there, just about it became a fight. From what I've heard described, like they didn't actually change that much. The South Park guys for the original South Park movie describe some of that, arbitrary capriciousness, where sometimes you're actually making it worse with the changes. Like not like worse in it's a worse movie, but like what they're complaining about, you're actually amplifying, which is how they ended up. I can't remember what the original title of the South Park movie was going to be, but the censors wouldn't allow them. So that's how they ended up with bigger, longer, uncut, as the subtitle. It's like, thanks, you guys actually made it more inappropriate, but
Right. And then you got some situations where, like, because as a horror movie, like, you can't be less than R, right? I mean, you don't want a PG horror movie because the expectation is very low.
Well, no, I mean, at this point there was PG-13, and there are definitely, like,
There's
these
some
days.
decent ones.
Yeah.
PG-13 horror movies can be effective, but most of the time, if they get that PG-13 rating, it's not bloody. It's usually supernatural, paranormal that actually gets the PG-13 ratings.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking of like the there's this thing, a marketing psyche, right, for like teenage boys. I mean, like,
Oh yeah.
And so like they would use the rating systems as a marketing tool, and it would even go beyond like the underground films and be like, this is an XXX, like banned in all countries,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I tried not to get too deep into that history, but before NC-17, that rating was called X, and then the adult film co-opted that to say, like, we're even more extreme than an X, we're XXX, like you were saying. And then in around 1990, the ratings board changed it from X to NC-17. There was the changes to like PG and PG-13, and so I mean, there's a whole fascinating history in there that we don't have time to go through in this episode. And there's actually, like, again, some fascinating documentaries. God, I need to remember what it was. There was a really good one. I think it's called like This Film is Unrated. That is literally about the history of the ratings board at that point. This is from like the mid 2000s or so.
Yeah, I think I saw that. They go over Mondo, whatever that movie was, Mondo something that had like cannibalism and all that in there.
Oh yeah. Cannibal Holocaust. Where that's one where people thought it was real, but they also have. But I mean, like they have like major people like Michael Moore, and I think and like the South Park guys and other people talking about their experience with the ratings board. Like I think Michael Moore was talking about, like, because he'd done his first big documentary, Roger and Me, around 88 or so. And there's two different scenes. There's one scene of like news footage of a man getting shot by the police. And there is another scene of him interviewing a woman who's skinning a rabbit. And they wanted to have him remove the scene of the woman skinning the rabbit, or I think they were threatening him with an X rating, but they were completely fine with the man getting shot. Interesting history all around, and interesting, discussion about censorship and what is censorship and market forces and all that goes with it. Especially as Rob, like you're talking about, like, the difference between trying to get an audience into NC-17 versus R versus PG-13. So, again, we could be here all day talking about that. So
I'm going to give you a 10-second nugget. You know my background in the music industry, and I mean, you don't even have to be in the music industry to know this. That if you're if you're a very talented rapper, but you don't have an explicit on your album, like that used to be a marketing tool. Like you have to, otherwise you're not really legit if you don't have an explicit sticker on your album cover.
Yeah, which do they even still do those anymore?
I don't know. They don't make CDs as much anymore, so hard to say.
That's really a great point, because they really had to do with the physical format.
Yeah, but I do know you still have like explicit and clean, like it's almost like a click-through bar, like when you're viewing the album at like iTunes and stuff. So.
Yeah. It's for children,
Yeah. Well, and like you get like the Kids Bop radio-friendly version where, where it's always funny, like, like Cardi B practically has to, like, or Megan Thee Stallion practically have to like write whole new songs.
I'm so sorry. We're on a tangent here. So yes.
Yeah. So rating. So editing's complete. We got an R rating on the film.
Yeah. With editing complete and an R rating secured, it was time for the premiere. It would open first in LA on December 18th, 1996, before releasing to the US and the rest of the US and Canada on December 20th. Again, this is 1996, where you don't have the worldwide premieres all at the same time like you tend to today. So it was just opening in the US and Canada, and then once it finished its run there, it would move to the rest of the world. So let's go to our local theater and buy a ticket and check out the film. Kristen, take us through the plot.
All right, guys, I'm very excited. I'm really looking forward to going through this plot summary, not only because I love this film, but also because the opening scene of Scream is just like one of the best ones of the last 30 years. I think it's so effective, so good, which is so funny. Once again, like we were talking about the dailies and how like back then they were like, this is not going to be any good. And it's so iconic. So let me set the scene for you. So it starts with a phone call. In the small town of Woodsboro, California, Casey Becker is home alone. She receives a call from an unknown person. The call starts out lighthearted with a mysterious person adding, like he finds out she's making popcorn to sit down and watch a scary movie, and then asks, "What's your favorite scary movie?" The call continues about horror movies until something shifts with Casey's question, "Why do you want to know my name?" The chilling reply is, "Because I want to know who I'm looking at." Okay, so Casey tries to end the conversation from there, but the mysterious guy keeps calling back until he tells Casey he'll gut her like a fish if she hangs up again. The mysterious caller orders Casey to play a horror trivia game with him. Get the answers right, and she may make it out of this. But answering wrong will cost both Casey and her boyfriend Steve, who is revealed to be tied up outside the house, their lives. Casey does well with the questions at first, but then she gets a trick Friday the 13th question wrong, and that leads to Steve's murder. Casey attempts to escape the house while someone in a black cloak and ghost-like mask searches around the house. Her parents are also pulling up the road at this point. So she's trying to escape the house. Parents are coming up the driveway, but before she can call to them for help, she's killed by the intruder, wearing what we now call a Ghostface costume. Her disemboweled corpse is hanging from a tree as her mother screams from the site, and the title card flashes on screen.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it is a hell of an opening, and we'll talk more about it in just a second. But Rob, what are your thoughts?
This is a great example of, if you don't like the movie in the first 10 minutes, you can leave. I guarantee anyone who watches the first 10 minutes is going to be suckered into it, because it is a classic masterclass of how to do an opening horror film scene. It's classic. That's what more can I say?
Yeah, and I think what makes it so effective is when it came to the marketing of this film, a lot of it was, we will kind of talk about who played Casey Becker, Drew Barrymore. But so like because Drew Barrymore is such a big part of the marketing, she's on the posters and everything, a lot of people were very shocked when they saw this for the first time in theaters, because that pretty much sets the scene right away to let the people know that are watching that anyone at any point in this movie can be killed off. Nobody is necessarily safe. Everybody is in danger. And I think that really establishes different rules for this slasher compared to other ones.
Yeah, so I mean, like you said, Casey is played by Drew Barrymore, and the other thing I think that makes it really effective is that a lot of people know her because of her first claim to fame, which was being the child actress on E.T., the Extraterrestrial, and that was just another huge movie in the early '80s. And if you basically kind of grew up with her, here you are seeing her in this movie. and you know she's an A actress. You don't expect this to happen. She kills the performance, no pun intended, right? She absolutely kills it. And then her character gets killed off. So it's very effective and very fun in that sense, right? Because like you realize that you're not dealing like with a predictable average movie. Drew Barrymore, she actually came from a whole family. I don't know if you know that her family was from Hollywood. I mean, her father was an actor, her grandfather,
great uncle. Yeah, no, like the history of cinema and theater in America is filled with her family.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. Later in her career, she's known for movies like Charlie's Angels, Batman Forever, Ever After, The Wedding Singer, 50 First Dates, Blended, Firestarter. Actually, was one of the earlier films of hers that in the horror. I guess you could say sci-fi horror genre. Yeah. And I know she has a talk show. I don't remember. Is the talk show the Drew Barrymore show? I don't know what the name of the show is, but I know
it's called Drew Barrymore Show. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of like taking the spot of like Ellen, like her and Kelly Clarkson.
Yeah, but instead of bullying the people, she just like has heart to hearts with them a lot. Drew Barrymore does. she'll have these people on the show and talk about different things that they encountered as a kid, because she has that experience of kind of going through some rough stuff, and so she has like, I've seen lots of clips online of her having these heart to hearts with these actors and just kind of talking to them like human beings and not as like a spectacle, which is really cool.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. This is like right as in that transition period for Drew, because she, like early 90s, she was the wild child. Like she was still dealing with her substance abuse problems. She was trying to break that child star image by doing a lot of movies like Poison Ivy, which was a erotic thriller, with where she's seducing Tom Skerritt of all people. It's very weird. But then, and she's flashing David Letterman on his show.
That's right.
So she had this kind of bad girl image, and it's right at around this time she starts to transition from that into things like Ever After, and even more so Never Been Kissed, and The Wedding Singer, and then Charlie's Angels, and on into the persona we know today. But this is that kind of bridge period, and so she was a big star. And Williamson, it was very deliberate that he wanted, that they wanted a big star for this part, and this was kind of doing a callback to Psycho and some of the classic films like that. Where Psycho had Janet Leigh in the lead role, and then killed her off about halfway through to, really shock the audience and give them that uncertain, unbalanced feeling.
I believe that she wanted to be the Sydney role, didn't she? Originally?
No,
she definitely wanted to be involved in some way, because she did read the script and was like very much wanted to be a part of it. But I don't necessarily,
She initially came in to read for Sydney. They wanted her for Sydney. She said, "Hey, can I do Casey instead? Like, I actually like the Casey role. I think that's better for me instead."
I think also just scheduling differences. I don't think it was necessarily her saying that she wanted to be Casey. It was more just like she just could not do a bigger role in this film. Lots going on at the time, so I think that it worked out this way, because like they did want somebody bigger in that role. I'm curious who it would have been had Drew Barrymore become Sydney. Like,
that's not one where I saw a lot of alternate names tossed around.
Yeah.
For the Ghostface costume, this would go on to become iconic. In the movie, I always found it strange, because they go like, it's, you can get it at any five and dime in the county, or whatever. And, I found that strange at the time, because at the time I'd never seen a costume like that anywhere. And so I thought it had been made for the movie, but it turns out like it was an actual off-the-shelf costume that they ended up having to license, that they tried to make their own. They couldn't make one as good, as effective as what you see in the movie. And so they ended up having to license it. So that was a little surprise to me. That,
I thought the same thing, Adam. Yeah, and you know, the episode started with with your the question was, you know, your experience with Scream, and it's funny, I should have mentioned it, but like, you know, when I saw at the time my, it must have been 7 or 8 year old wanted to be the Scream character for Halloween. It just really resonated that you know, I'm in this era where Scream, the Scream character, the ghost face is the character to be. It's no longer Jason, you know, my era.
yeah.
So.
Oh
Well,
yeah,
you know,
big deal.
well,
I recall from when I even grew up, like being Ghostface was a big deal, and I remember like there were kids on Halloween that would chase the little kids around in the Ghostface costume before I even, you know, before Scream was even on my radar back when I was like 9 years
right.
old.
oh yeah. See, I can remember being like 8 or 9, and you know, kids doing Freddy Krueger. So,
Right.
but
Yeah,
you know, and you know, one of the things that you know, good filmmaking, you don't notice like certain things that don't quite make sense because you're too engaged in the story and the momentum of it. But realistically, based on the timing of like the killer grabs her just as her parents like do the first look outside, or like are just walking into the
Mm-hmm.
house, you know, and then they do the whole look around the house, takes like maybe 5 minutes. And then by the time they run outside, she's already hung up and elaborately
Right.
gutted and everything. That timeline isn't that realistic, you know, but it's one of
That's
those.
true, but it's a lot of fun. I think that
Yeah,
whole
no, but
like,
that's what I mean. It's like
yeah,
sometimes, you know, like lot good movies override your logic brain.
yeah. Like
Where,
if you
mhm.
have to do kind of pick it apart, it takes away from the fun of it for sure.
well,
But
it's
it
not
did it
even
at
that
the
it
right.
takes away from the fun of it. If they're doing their job right, it's not even until much later hindsight that you're even going to go,
Yes.
wait, hey, that doesn't quite make sense. But then you go, it's the movie's good. It's fine. Don't worry
Yeah.
about it. You
But
know,
also just like the level of detail in this makes you not even notice those little things because like I something I've noticed because I've seen this movie a bunch of
yeah,
times and every time about that opening scene I notice something different that I come to appreciate. Like this time around, something I really like and that I really noticed and kind of stuck out to me this time was when the parents have the phone call, like they pick up the phone and they hear Casey making these like noises as she's dying and they're trying to figure out where she is and what's going on. And it's just like such a great little detail that's just like so chilling. It's just
mhm,
perfect, like chef's kiss, man. And that's like something I didn't even notice necessarily or even hadn't been on my radar, but from watching it for
yeah.
this episode, I was like, wow, like the detail and the little moments like that all make that scene just really, really
Yeah.
effective.
Well, and
Hmm.
I mentioned, you know, that Williamson was you know, inspired by the fact he was using a cordless phone, which was still a newer technology. It wasn't brand new; it'd been around for a while, but uh, it still was a newer technology at the time. And you know, the fact that and another bit of technology that we'll talk about uh, more in part two, trying not to give spoilers so you actually tune in for that, you know, meant, you know, back in the 70s, if a caller is calling, they had to be on a phone attached to a cord. Uh,
Right.
you know, you know, now a caller could be much more mobile. And like that's even a plot point in another movie from a little bit before this that I watched recently, Pump Up the Volume with Christian Slater, where
Hmm.
he's running a pirate radio station out of his house and helps use cordless phones to disguise his location. Um, you know, so it's you know that this would be, you know, the equivalent today of, you know, deciding you wanted to do something with maybe AI or VR, but you know, just something that's, you know, that, you know, maybe we didn't have even 10 or 15 years ago that would change how people react or do things in a movie. Uh,
Yeah, so that was like a really good effective opening scene. But what's crazy is it has this opening scene, and usually in an opening scene, you would meet the main character, but as we've talked about, it doesn't do that. So it's this next scene, we actually finally do get to meet our main character, and that's Sydney Prescott, and then we also meet her boyfriend, Billy Loomis, who sneaks in through her bedroom window. And he comes in, and she's like, "What are you doing here?" And he's talking about how he was watching The Exorcist on TV, it made him think of her. He compares the edited TV version of The Exorcist to the relationship and what it's been like lately, saying that all the good stuff has been edited out. And so they're kind of talking a little bit more, and there's this cover of Don't Fear the Reaper, sung by Gus Black, kind of softly playing in the background, kind of setting the scene, giving you a little bit of hint of something's afoot. You don't know what yet. But some other important things about Sydney I wanted to establish before we kind of continue in with the rest of the plot. So her father, Neil, he travels for work pretty often, and in this part of the story, he's heading off on a weekend trip, a work trip, and he'll be gone for the weekend. And so Sydney will be home alone during this point. And she's also struggling with the impending first anniversary of the rape and murder of her mother, Maureen. And so she's kind of got a lot on her plate. She identified the killer as Todd and Weary, this guy that her mother was seeing at the time, and that led to his arrest. So she's kind of got a lot going on for being 16 years old. Also with the fact that because of this kind of trauma, she can't really consummate her relationship with Billy, who is really trying to reignite that fire they once had. And her way of kind of working things out with him is asking if he'll settle for like a PG-13 relationship instead. So that kind of sets the scene, establishes these two characters. We get an idea of like a conflict, but it's not really clear yet. What are you guys' thoughts about this part?
Well, and you know, when she talks about a PG-13 relationship, again, you talk about the meta nature of the movie.
Right.
She flashes him as he's leaving the window, but it's shot like you would for a PG-13 movie where her back is to the audience. They don't see anything. It is, you know, reinforcing, you know, the PG-13 nature.
Just really smart filmmaking.
Yeah.
I think it's obvious they're establishing, you know, these two characters, and Nev Campbell is an important, you know, I think right now you're trying to feel her out, you know, Sydney Prescott.
Sort of like Billy is.
Right, exactly.
Yes, he is.
Sorry. Maybe not quite the same way, but Sydney Prescott is played by Nev Campbell, and you know, if you know, prior to this role, she was Nev Campbell was a breakout star from the Fox teen drama series Party of Five, and then she went on to have a big role in The Craft. And it was her role in The Craft that I think that was really made Wes Craven, you know, select her and ask her to audition for the role of Sydney Prescott.
There were other movies that she was in. Wild Things was one that got a lot of PR back in the day.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Because there's a
I think every guy my age has seen at least a certain particular scene from Wild Things.
There's Drowning Mona, Panic, Skyscraper, The Castle in the Ground. She produced and starred and wrote in the story for the drama film The Company. TV credits include Manhattan, House of Cards, recently The Lincoln Lawyer, and the 2023 post-apocalyptic series Twisted Metal.
I didn't know she was in Twisted Metal. That's based off a video game. Yeah, Anthony Mackie's stars in that.
She's been doing a little more TV lately, but yeah, she did, you know, kind of reprised her role as Sydney and did two more recent Scream movies. Well, actually, no, just the one, not for Scream 6, because that was the one where they were like, she was like, "Pay me what you owe me," and they were like, "Oh no, we just won't put you in the movie." And so it was kind of this awkward thing where they were kind of like, "Oh yeah, Sydney's off in New York with her family or whatever." You know, they made some crap up.
Yeah. Real quick, I mean, I know this is early in the film, but so far I think she's doing a pretty decent job. You know, when it was stated before that Drew Barrymore was possibly going to play Sydney, you could see that, but you cannot see Neve play Drew Barrymore's role. I could not see her doing the beginning of this film. That opening scene, there's no way, because Drew was just amazing at it. Yeah. Anyways,
I'm sorry, I just got reminded of a little tidbit, kind of jumping back to Drew's performance. to keep herself in the right emotional place. That she had read about the death of a dog just before she came to set, and she worked with Wes and had kind of crafted this story around the death of that dog, and he would tell it to her until she was just in tears, and like every time she kind of like needed to access that place or start to get out of there, he would just say like, remember the dog, and she would just start going again.
Wow.
Crazy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Nev Campbell, whose character's name is Sydney, her boyfriend, as we were told, is Billy Loomis, is played by Skeet Ulrich. Skeet. That's his name. Skeet Ulrich, and he's best known in this role as Billy Loomis, but he has also been in other 90s films. There was The Craft, and he played a guy named Vincent a character named Vincent in As Good as It Gets. He's also known for the TV show Riverdale, playing Jughead's dad, F.P. Jones II, and a couple other roles he took on in different series, in Jericho, Law and Order. You guys might be more familiar than I am with
Jericho
him.
was really good. Jericho was a good show.
Yeah, they also kind of bring him back in the newer films in a very intriguing way. Because, like, as you guys have seen this movie, you know this man's fate. They won't totally give it away, but they find an interesting way to bring him back in the two recent sequels.
Oh,
But,
wow. One thing I just want to say, though, is like, Skeet at his age during this movie, I think he's a great character. He does a great job here, because one of the things that they want you to question is whether or not he is the killer. Mm-hmm. And he's got this seedy look in his eyes and this kind of smug attitude, that you really think he's involved one way or another.
He's so suspicious looking.
Right.
But it's also, he can switch where you then kind of feel bad for suspecting him.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Even for someone who's rewatching this, so you know whether you should or shouldn't, that I think he did a masterful job in this role. It was interesting that he actually, it wasn't until a scene we'll talk about in part 2 with more of the rest of the cast, where he thought some of the other cast members were screwing it up, like, because they were leaning too hard, they were being too comedic. And then it wasn't until then that he realized what the movie was, that he was, taking it, he thought it was like a very serious movie. So,
okay.
So, I think that approach kind of helped him with his particular character. And then just some other, quick trivia things with him. Many times as I have seen Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I did not know he was in it. I knew Sam Rockwell has a small part in it. Future Oscar winner Sam Rockwell is in the Turtles movie. But I did not realize Skeet was one of the young guys hanging out with the Foot Clan. And then, also, I had heard that his stepfather was a NASCAR driver.
Yeah.
Which was pretty cool.
And it's such an interesting. Go ahead. Were you gonna explain?
Well, I was just gonna say, I was looking at some of his photos, and I'm not calling people out for aging, but he looks a lot different than he did when he was younger. Like, some people look the same, because I was thinking about how he, like you said, he did a great job playing this role, and he looked both very guilty, and at times he looked innocent, and he nailed it. But I think he looks much different as he got older in these other roles. I don't think he could get away with looking so innocent later on in his career.
Yeah, well, some of that is, some people when they're much younger, are very gaunt, and he was very on the thin side. And, just how the hollows that gave his face, and I think he filled out a bit as he, got even, out of his mid-20s and, into his 30s and 40s and 50s. And so, that changes how we perceive the face sometimes.
And I mean, the hollowness you're talking about, it's not like because he was just born a certain way or anything. He like had a lot of poor health growing up, or like a lot of illnesses and stuff like that. And so he kind of had this kind of weird stature when he was younger, kind of like a smaller stature. And so his soccer coach when he was a kid will call him Skeeter, because he was like fast as a mosquito, is how Skeet Ulrich described it. And so I guess at some point he decided he was just going to go by that for acting, compared to his born name, which is Brian Ray Trout, which also is kind of a cool name. Honestly, like Trout as a last name is pretty cool too. But, Ulrich is obviously the NASCAR driver's last name, that his stepfather that was mentioned. But yeah, very interesting guy. He's such an interesting character in Riverdale. It's actually, so I haven't caught up with Riverdale. I kind of gave up after it got crazy. But when I was watching it, when I made the connection that F.P. Jones was Billy from Scream, my mind was just blown, because I'm like, I cannot believe that's the same guy. That's crazy. Yeah. So it's just funny to see they grow up, and they do sometimes just look like different people, but I still think he looks pretty dang good. That's just my personal opinion.
And that is where we're going to have to stop for today. Join us in part 2 so we can learn if anyone can stop Ghostface. Do Sydney and Billy keep their relationship PG-13? And most importantly, will Sydney's father enjoy his conference? Find out the answers next time on the Savage Movie Night Podcast. Thanks so much to my co-hosts, Rob and Kristen. Thanks so much to our editor, Javi, and the entire Savage Content team. Thanks so much to our sponsor, Jazzology with Willard Jenkins. And most importantly, thanks to all of you for listening. Please give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe, like, ring the bell, leave a comment, all the good YouTube things. I've been your host, Adam, and we'll see you next time on the Savage Movie Night Podcast.